The end of the Bronze Age was arguably the worst disaster in ancient history. Across the Mediterranean, glittering palaces and vast trade networks vanished in a historical blink of an eye, plunging the world into a centuries-long silence. This is the mystery of the Bronze Age collapse, and for generations, the blame has fallen on mysterious invaders known only as the Sea Peoples. By the end of this investigation, you will understand the complex web of climate, conflict, and vulnerability that truly toppled these mighty kingdoms. Were these shadowy warriors the cause of the collapse, or merely a symptom of a world already coming apart? What forces can make an entire civilization forget how to read and build? We will sift through ash and ancient inscriptions to find the answers. What does the fall of a world 3,000 years old tell us about the stability of our own? This was a world of unprecedented connection. Think of it not as a collection of isolated kingdoms, but as the first true international age. A Mycenaean Greek merchant in a bustling port might handle ingots of copper from Cyprus, destined to be alloyed with tin from distant Afghanistan to forge bronze weapons for a Hittite army. Egyptian gold and glass traveled north, while fine pottery and olive oil from the Aegean found its way to palaces across the eastern Mediterranean. It was a complex, interlocking system of gift exchange, royal diplomacy, and far-flung commerce that bound these societies together. At the top of this system sat the great powers, communicating in a manner that feels surprisingly modern. In the 14th century before the Common Era, pharaohs of Egypt and kings of empires like the Hittites and Babylonians wrote to each other on clay tablets. This archive, discovered at a site called Amarna, reveals a world of careful protocol. They addressed each other as brother, exchanged lavish gifts to cement alliances, and negotiated marriages between royal families. A letter from the Babylonian king to the Egyptian pharaoh might complain that the gold sent was not of the promised quality, showing a keen eye for the terms of trade even among allies. This was a delicate dance of power where conflict was costly and stability was maintained through a careful balance. The evidence of this cosmopolitan spirit is etched in stone and baked into clay. The grand palaces of Mycenae, with their famous Lion Gate, stored vast quantities of oil and grain, managing complex economies. In the Syrian coastal city of Ugarit, scribes worked in multiple languages, keeping records for merchants whose ships crisscrossed the sea. Artistic styles blended, with Egyptian motifs appearing in Aegean frescoes and Mycenaean pottery designs influencing local crafts in the Levant. It was a golden age of artistic expression and technological sophistication, all built upon the steady flow of resources and information. Yet this glittering edifice stood on a fragile foundation. The entire system relied on a few critical pillars: constant harvests to feed concentrated urban populations, secure trade routes for essential materials like tin and copper, and stable, cooperative relations between the major royal houses. The prosperity was real, but it was also centralized and brittle. Most wealth and authority were concentrated in the palace complexes, which acted as the sole engines of the economy. If the palace faltered, the entire societal structure around it could crumble. This intricate, globalized world of the late Bronze Age was a magnificent achievement, but its very interconnectedness would become its greatest weakness when the first cracks began to appear. The stability of this interconnected world began to fray not with the sound of clashing swords, but with the silence of failing rains. Decades before the first reports of foreign ships, the very environment that supported these great civilizations turned against them. Scientific evidence, locked away in the most unlikely of places, tells a story of profound climatic change. By studying the growth rings of ancient trees and the layers of sediment at the bottom of ancient lakes, researchers have identified a period of severe and prolonged drought that gripped the eastern Mediterranean around the year 1200 before the Common Era. This was not a single bad season. It was a mega-drought, a relentless stretch of arid years that would have pushed the agricultural systems of the time to their absolute breaking point. Picture the ripple effects of such a catastrophe. In a society where the palace's power rested on its ability to collect and redistribute grain, consecutive crop failures would have been devastating. Storehouses, the very symbols of royal authority, would have emptied. The careful balance of trade would have been upended as kingdoms hoarded what little surplus they had. Famine would have followed, not as a sudden event, but as a creeping shadow that deepened social divisions. Archaeological evidence suggests this period saw a significant movement of people away from the parched interior regions toward the coasts, placing new pressures on already stressed port cities. This environmental stress acted as a powerful push factor, creating populations that were desperate, mobile, and less tied to the failing authority of their traditional rulers. Simultaneously, the earth itself seemed to grow restless. The archaeological record from several key sites shows evidence of massive destruction layers that cannot be easily attributed to human conflict. In some cases, great walls were found to have fallen outward, as if shaken from their foundations. While not a single cataclysmic event, a series of significant earthquakes during this turbulent period likely damaged critical infrastructure, toppled fortifications, and further shattered the illusion of security and divine favor that kings relied upon. As archaeologist Jesse Millek and others have pointed out, these compounding crises, drought, famine, and seismic activity, created a cascade of internal failures. They eroded the economic and ideological foundations of the palace system from within. The social contract between the ruling elite and the common people, based on protection and provision in exchange for labor and loyalty, was breaking down. This was a world becoming profoundly vulnerable, its resilience worn thin by years of relentless hardship. The stage was not merely set for an invasion, it was primed for a total systemic collapse where any external shock could trigger a domino effect of unimaginable scale. Into this fractured world, the first clear reports of a new and terrifying threat began to arrive. The most vivid testimony comes not from a crumbling city, but from the walls of an Egyptian temple. At Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III, a sprawling series of stone carvings tells a story of invasion and salvation. The inscriptions speak of foreign peoples who came from the sea, moving with a terrifying momentum. The text declares, the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. It is here, in this ancient propaganda, that we first encounter the names that have echoed through history, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyon, and others, collectively labeled by modern scholars as the Sea Peoples. The reliefs depict a chaotic naval battle, with Egyptian archers firing from sleek ships upon the vessels of their enemies, who are shown in distinct headdresses and clothing. The accompanying hieroglyphs describe a coordinated assault by land and sea, a desperate migration of entire communities, not just warriors, but with their families and possessions loaded into ox carts. Ramesses claims a glorious victory, stating he turned back the invaders and settled the survivors within Egypt's borders. For a long time, historians took this narrative at face value, seeing in these carvings the portrait of the primary destroyers of the Bronze Age world. Yet we must read these sources with a critical eye. Egyptian temple inscriptions were not objective news reports. They were divine dramas, designed to showcase the pharaoh as the protector of cosmic order against the forces of chaos. A total victory had to be proclaimed, regardless of the messy reality on the ground. This leads us directly to the heart of the modern debate. Were the Sea Peoples the singular cause of the collapse, a tsunami of violence that swept away established kingdoms, Or were they themselves a symptom of the wider disintegration, desperate refugees and opportunistic raiders pushed into motion by the earlier crises of drought and famine? The Egyptian records, focused on their own borders, give us only a snapshot of the final, violent chapter. They tell us nothing of what happened in the homelands of these groups, or what pressures forced them to become marauders in the first place. Their sudden appearance in the historical record marks the moment when widespread disruption became impossible for even the most powerful state to ignore. To understand their true role, we must look past Pharaoh Ramesses' claims of glory and search for their footprints in the ashes of the cities they are said to have destroyed. The names carved at Medinet Habu are haunting, but they are just labels given by their enemies. To understand who these invaders really were, we must look past the Egyptian propaganda and piece together a more human story from scattered clues. The term Sea Peoples itself is a modern convenience, a catch-all phrase for a collection of groups mentioned in the records: the Peliset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, and others. Scholars have long debated whether these names refer to a single, coordinated army sweeping across the Mediterranean, or something far more complex, a chaotic mosaic of displaced communities, opportunistic pirates, and skilled warriors all caught in the same historical current. The evidence suggests the latter is far more likely. These were not a unified nation with a single homeland, but disparate bands pushed into motion by the same droughts and famines that were crippling the great kingdoms. Think of it not as an invasion in the traditional sense, but as a desperate migration that turned violent when these groups crashed into the fortified borders of states that were already struggling to survive. One of the most compelling links comes from the name Peliset. Many historians and archaeologists connect this group to the Philistines, a people well known from later biblical texts who settled on the southern coast of Canaan. Archaeological digs at sites like Ashkelon have uncovered a distinct style of pottery in the layers dating to just after the collapse, pottery that bears a striking resemblance to types previously made in the Aegean world. This is not the smoking gun of a specific army, but it is a powerful clue, a cultural fingerprint left by a community that brought its traditions to a new home. It suggests that among these sea peoples were populations from the Mycenaean world, perhaps skilled warriors and artisans whose own societies had fragmented, now seeking a foothold in a new land. Other names hint at origins across the Mediterranean. The Denyen might have connections to the Danaioi, a Homeric term for Greeks. The Shekelesh could be linked to Sicily, and the Lucca to the coast of Anatolia. What emerges is a picture of a vast, multidirectional movement. The old system's collapse created a power vacuum and set entire populations adrift. Some groups may have begun as mercenaries, hired by one failing kingdom to fight another, only to turn on their employers when pay or food ran out. Others were undoubtedly refugees, families traveling with all their worldly goods, searching for stable ground. When they encountered resistance, these journeys became conflicts. So the force that Ramesses III faced was probably a composite one, a temporary and volatile alliance of different peoples united by immediate need rather than a shared identity. They were both a cause and a consequence, a human tide born from the very collapse they are so often blamed for creating. Their story is not one of mindless destruction, but of survival, displacement, and the painful birth of new worlds from the ashes of the old. This reframing is crucial, for if the sea peoples were as much a symptom as a disease, then the real mystery deepens. What could weaken the foundations of an entire age so thoroughly that it could not withstand such a shock? To find that answer, we must look closer at the final days of the palaces themselves. Far to the north of Egypt, in the heart of what is now Turkey, another great power was grappling with threats on its frontiers. The Hittite Empire, a formidable rival to Egypt, kept meticulous records on clay tablets stored in its capital of Hattusa. Within these archives, a name appears that has captivated historians: Ahhiyawa. Most experts now agree this name refers to the world of the Mycenaean Greeks, the builders of palaces like Mycenae and Pylos. This is not a simple label for a distant land. The tablets reveal a complex and often tense diplomatic relationship. The Hittite kings wrote to the ruler of Archaeology as a brother, a term reserved for equals, acknowledging his power across the sea. But the correspondence is laced with tension, discussing disputes over territories in western Anatolia and accusations of harboring rebellious Hittite vassals. One fascinating letter even discusses the extradition of a renegade smith, highlighting how skilled artisans could become pawns in a geopolitical struggle. This evidence paints a picture of active Mycenaean involvement in Anatolian affairs, not as shadowy destroyers, but as a competing imperial power engaging in proxy conflicts and strategic maneuvers. It suggests the great powers were not passive victims waiting for a storm to hit. They were actively, and sometimes recklessly, jostling for advantage in a world that was growing more unstable by the year. The Mycenaeans may have supported local rebellions to weaken Hittite control over valuable coastal regions, further fraying the political fabric of the region. This adds a critical layer of intrigue to the collapse narrative. The end did not come solely from outside. It was also accelerated by rivalries and interventions from within the circle of so-called civilized states. But what if the Mycenaean world, this Archaeology of the Hittite texts, was itself beginning to crack? The very warriors and ships that once projected power abroad could, in a time of internal crisis, become agents of chaos. As drought and famine strained the Mycenaean palace economies, the social order they upheld began to fragment. The centralized authority that commissioned fine pottery and organized large-scale trade started to break down. In such a climate, the professional warrior class, the ones who fought for the palace, could find themselves without a patron. Some may have turned to piracy, their seafaring skills now used to raid the very trade routes they once protected. Others, perhaps entire communities displaced by internal conflict or crop failure, may have joined the wider movement of peoples, becoming the Denyen or other groups later labeled as Sea Peoples. This theory presents a haunting possibility that some of the invaders were not mysterious foreigners, but were in a sense the former guardians of the Bronze Age order, now cast adrift and forced to prey upon its remains. The story transforms from a simple tale of civilized kingdoms versus barbarian hordes into a far more tragic and complex drama of interconnected failure, where the lines between cause and effect, between insider and outsider, become profoundly blurred. The wave began to crest in the final decades of the 13th century before the Common Era. We can trace its path not in the movement of armies, but in the silence that followed fire. The first domino may well have been the great Hittite capital, Hattusa. Perched on the rocky plateau of central Anatolia, this was the nerve center of an empire, a city of monumental gates and vast archives. Yet around the year 1200 before the Common Era, it was not conquered in a long siege but consumed. Archaeologists found its grand temples and palaces burned in an intense, deliberate fire. The clay tablets in the royal archives were baked hard by the flames, preserving their final messages for posterity. But after the smoke cleared, no one returned to reclaim the site. Hattusa was simply abandoned, left to the wind and the wolves, as if the very idea of the Hattusa had been extinguished. The collapse of this imperial anchor sent shockwaves through the entire system, severing critical diplomatic and trade links that stretched from Anatolia to Egypt. To the south, on the coast of modern-day Syria, the vibrant port city of Ugarit received the news with growing dread. A fragment of a clay letter found in its ruins captures the moment of impending doom. It is a desperate plea from the city's king, possibly to a neighboring ally on the island of Cyprus. The text is heartbreaking in its urgency. It reads, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The letter asks, perhaps fruitlessly, for assistance. Archaeological evidence shows this was no idle fear. Ugarit was sacked and burned so completely that it never recovered as a major urban center. The fire was so fierce it vitrified parts of the stone architecture. This was not a raid, it was an erasure. The silencing of Ugarit was catastrophic, as it was one of the primary commercial hubs linking the Aegean world with the empires of the Near East. With its docks in ashes, the flow of tin, copper, and luxury goods choked off, starving the remaining kingdoms of the resources they needed to sustain themselves. The crisis then rolled westward across the sea. In Greece, the magnificent palace complexes of the Mycenaean world met similarly violent ends. At Pylos on the southwestern coast, the end came suddenly. Excavations show no signs of a prolonged attack or siege. Instead, the palace was put to the torch in a single catastrophic event. So rapid was the destruction that people fled, leaving behind stores of precious olive oil still in their jars and unbaked clay tablets on the administrative desks, their records of taxes and shipments forever frozen in time. A similar story unfolded at Mycenae itself, the city of the legendary Agamemnon. Its mighty cyclopean walls, which had stood for centuries, could not save it. Intense fire gutted the palace atop the citadel. Across the region from Thebes to Turin, the pattern repeats, a layer of ash and destruction, followed not by rebuilding but by a profound silence. The intricate bureaucracy that kept these palaces running, the linear B script used for their inventories, vanished entirely from the historical record. It was a loss not just of life and property, but of knowledge itself. This geographical and chronological tour reveals the true nature of the disaster. It was not a single invading army marching in a straight line, but a rolling collapse, a cascade of failures. The fall of Hattusa disrupted grain supplies and military alliances. The burning of Ugarit severed maritime trade routes. Each fallen city removed a vital node from the network, placing immense strain on the next. A kingdom that relied on imported tin to arm its soldiers would find itself helpless when the ships stopped coming. A population already weakened by drought and famine would have little strength to resist when violence finally arrived at its gates. The archaeological hallmarks are consistent: widespread fire, sudden abandonment, and the cessation of all centralized administration and writing. This pattern tells us the collapse targeted the very institutions of power, the palaces and their scribes. When the last clay tablet was baked in the flames of Pylos, an entire way of organizing the world, of recording it and controlling it, passed away. What could possibly follow such a comprehensive unraveling? The answer lies in the long, quiet centuries that came after, a period once called a dark age, but which we now see as a time of profound and necessary transformation. To understand how these mobile groups could threaten the very pillars of civilization, we must step onto the imagined battlefield. The Egyptian carvings at Medinet Habu provide our most detailed, though one-sided, visual record of their methods. The invaders are shown not as a disorganized rabble, but as disciplined fighters. Their ships with high prows and bird-headed designs are clearly built for the open sea, not just coastal travel. In the heat of battle, these warriors wield long, straight swords ideal for slashing, a stark contrast to the shorter, thrusting swords common in some armies of the time. They carry round shields and javelins, and most tellingly, they fight as cohesive infantry units, both on land and from the decks of their vessels. This points to a martial culture built around foot soldiers and naval mobility, a significant departure from the military doctrine that had dominated the great kingdoms for centuries. The power of empires like Egypt and the Hittites had long rested on a very different kind of force, the chariot. These were not mere transports, but the ancient equivalent of main battle tanks, fast platforms for elite archers and spearmen. A charge of hundreds of these vehicles was meant to break enemy lines and sow terror. Yet this system had profound vulnerabilities. It was incredibly expensive, requiring specialized craftsmen, constant training for horses and crews, and a vast logistical network to supply spare parts and fodder. More critically, chariots were most effective on flat, open terrain. Against mobile infantry who could fight in rough hills or along wooded coastlines, or in the context of a society where the supply chains for maintaining these complex machines had broken down, the chariot's advantage could vanish entirely. This is where the invaders may have found their opening. They were not fighting to conquer territory in a traditional set-piece battle. They were fighting to break through, to raid, and to secure a new place to live. Their warfare was one of movement and adaptation. Some historians have speculated they may have used their ships not merely as transports, but as agile weapons platforms, employing tactics that allowed them to close quickly on coastal settlements or outmaneuver heavier, oar-driven Egyptian vessels. The question of technology also looms large. A persistent theory suggests these groups may have had early access to iron weaponry, which, though not yet superior in quality to well-made bronze, was becoming more widespread. If they utilized iron in greater quantities, it could have given them a logistical edge, as iron ore is more common than the copper and tin needed for bronze. Yet this remains a point of fierce debate among archaeologists, with many noting that the actual artifacts found from this period show a mix of materials, and no clear evidence places large-scale iron use squarely with the Sea Peoples. Perhaps their greatest weapon was not made of metal at all, but of circumstance. They fought in a world where the old rules were disintegrating. The professional armies and chariot corps of the great kingdoms depended entirely on the palace economy, on the scribes who allocated rations and the workshops that produced arms. As those central systems failed, the ability to field and sustain such forces would have crumbled. The invaders, by contrast, may have been fighting for their immediate survival, with a flexibility and desperation that a rigid, top-down military structure could not match. Their style of combat did not need to be technologically revolutionary to be devastatingly effective. It simply needed to be resilient enough to exploit a world that was already coming apart at the seams. This shift from chariot-based aristocracy to mobile infantry foreshadowed the future of warfare in the Mediterranean. In toppling the old order, these mysterious fighters may have inadvertently cleared the ground for the very different kinds of armies and the very different societies that would rise from the ashes centuries later. The true devastation of this era was measured not just in burned timbers but in silent harbors and empty storehouses. While the battles were dramatic, the collapse was cemented by a far quieter killer: the systematic failure of the economy that bound this world together. This was a globalized system, and its vital arteries were suddenly severed. One of the most critical was the long-distance trade in tin. This rare metal, essential for making bronze, traveled thousands of miles from sources in places like modern Afghanistan to workshops across the Mediterranean. When political order broke down and piracy made sea lanes treacherous, that flow simply stopped. Archaeologists find evidence of a bronze famine in the layers following the collapse, with communities desperately recycling old tools and weapons because they could no longer acquire the raw materials to make new ones. An army cannot fight with promises, and a society cannot function when it loses the basic recipe for its most important technology. Simultaneously, the distribution networks for food collapsed. The great palaces had acted as central banks and redistribution centers, collecting grain from the countryside to feed urban artisans, scribes, and soldiers. With the palaces in ashes, that bureaucratic machine vanished. The safe passage of grain ships could no longer be guaranteed by royal authority. This led to a brutal localization of life. Regions that had once specialized, growing olives for oil or grapes for wine to trade, were forced to turn every available plot into subsistence farmland simply to avoid starvation. The economic sophistication that allowed for specialization and wealth evaporated. replaced by a desperate, inward-looking struggle for basic survival. The sea itself, once the great connector of this age, transformed from a highway into a barrier. The maritime routes that carried ideas, luxury goods, and diplomatic messages became too dangerous for all but the shortest, most cautious journeys. It was as if the ancient internet had gone dark, plunging each community into isolated silence. This economic strangulation helps explain why the collapse was so total and the recovery so agonizingly slow. The invaders did not need to sack every city to doom the system. They only needed to disrupt the fragile nodes and routes that made the system work. By making trade impossible, they helped dismantle the very idea of international cooperation and complex economy. The loss was profound. It was a loss of connectivity, of shared knowledge, and of the collective security that comes from interdependence. In the silence that followed, people did not forget how to build or farm, but they did forget how to be part of something larger than their own village. The world shrank, and the bright, interconnected civilization of the Bronze Age faded into a legend, remembered only in fragmentary tablets and the ruins of palaces whose purpose would puzzle generations to come. The most profound casualty was not a city but a voice. In the wake of the fires and the migrations, a deep and unsettling silence settled over the lands. This silence was literal, the ceasing of written records. The intricate linear B script of the Mycenaean palaces, used for centuries to tally jars of oil and chariot wheels, was never written again. In Anatolia, the vast cuneiform archives of the Hittites, filled with laws, treaties, and literature, fell still. The knowledge of how to shape these symbols, to press wedge-shaped marks into clay or draw lines on tablets, simply faded from memory within a generation or two. Imagine a society where the administrative class, the scribes and accountants, vanishes overnight. The practical consequence was immediate. No one could read the old inventory lists to know what was stored where, or understand the treaties that defined borders. But the deeper loss was cultural, a severing of the thread that connected the present to its own past. A people had forgotten how to speak to their own history. This cognitive dark age extended far beyond the written word. The skills required for grand artistic expression seemed to evaporate. The vibrant frescoes that adorned palace walls, depicting processions and mythological scenes, gave way to simpler, cruder designs. The sophisticated techniques of lost wax casting for bronze statues and fine metal inlay work became rare, then vanished. Even the engineering knowledge for monumental architecture, for constructing corbelled vaults and cyclopean walls, was no longer practiced. Communities still built shelters, of course, but they did not build palaces. It was as if the collective blueprint for civilization had been misplaced. This regression suggests a catastrophic simplification of society. When every day is consumed by the immediate struggle for food and security, there is no surplus energy, no patron, and no need for court painters or master architects. The specialized roles that make high culture possible cannot survive. The true tragedy, therefore, was not merely the destruction wrought by invaders, but the rupture in cultural transmission. The invaders may have toppled the institutions, the palaces and temples that employed the artists and fed the scribes. But the deeper wound was the breaking of the chain by which a master teaches an apprentice, a parent teaches a child, a culture teaches its next generation. When that chain is broken, knowledge does not sleep, it dies. A potter might still make a usable pot, but the specific decorative motifs that held cultural meaning could be lost forever. A bard might still tell stories of great heroes, but the written epics that ensured those stories remained consistent across centuries were gone. Each community was left to rebuild its world from a much smaller set of remembered tools and tales. This loss of literacy stands as the starkest measure of the collapse's depth. It marks the boundary between a complex, integrated civilization and a fragmented, local one. To forget how to read and write is to lose a primary tool for complex thought, for planning beyond the harvest cycle, and for preserving law and identity. The silence in the archaeological record for the next several centuries is not an empty one. It is a silence heavy with struggle, adaptation, and a slow, painstaking process of reinvention. The people of the so-called Dark Ages were not less intelligent. They were survivors in a diminished world, forced to focus on the fundamentals of life while the echoes of a grander past faded into myth. What kind of world eventually grew from this stripped-down foundation? The answer lies in a transformation so complete it gave birth to an entirely new age. The silence that followed the collapse was not empty, it was filled with stories. When the written record ceased, memory took a different form, weaving the trauma of a fallen age into the fabric of epic and myth. These legendary narratives, passed down orally for centuries before being written anew, may hold the faintest echoes of that catastrophic time. Consider the great Greek epic cycle with its centerpiece, the tale of the Trojan War. Historians have long debated if a real conflict lies at its heart, but its broader themes feel eerily resonant with the end of the Bronze Age. It is a story of a coalition of Greek kings sailing across the sea to besiege a mighty, walled city in Anatolia, a decade-long conflict ending in fire, slaughter, and a perilous journey home. This narrative of aristocratic warfare, naval expeditions, and the sacking of great cities mirrors the kind of warfare and instability that defined the era's final chaotic century. The heroes of these poems, like Agamemnon, the lord of golden Mycenae, return to kingdoms that are unstable or fallen, a world out of joint. These epics may not be history, but they could well be the cultural memory of a time when such events were not just poetic fantasy, but a terrifying reality. Across the Mediterranean, other traditions preserve similar shadows. The biblical books of Judges and Samuel tell of the Philistines, a powerful coastal people who clashed repeatedly with the emerging Israelites. The name Philistine is linguistically linked to the Peliset, one of the groups named at Medinet Habu as a sea people. The archaeological record confirms that new, culturally distinct settlements appeared on the southern coast of Canaan around the time of the collapse, settlements associated with Aegean-style pottery. The biblical stories, written down centuries later, frame these conflicts in a theological context, but they may preserve a folk memory of the arrival and settlement of these foreign groups, and the long struggle for dominance in the region that followed. Even the broader narrative of the Israelite conquest of Canaan, with its tales of cities falling, could reflect a simplified memory of the widespread urban destructions that characterized the period, reinterpreted through a later cultural lens. We must tread carefully here, for myth is not a history book. These stories were shaped and reshaped over generations to serve religious, moral, and national purposes. They compress time, blend events, and introduce divine actors where historians see human or environmental causes, yet the parallels are too compelling to ignore. Great societal catastrophes, the kind that shatter a world, do not vanish without a trace in the human psyche. They become the stuff of legend, the foundational stories that explain how the world changed. The tale of a golden age lost, of a great flood, of wandering heroes and fallen cities, these are universal themes born from universal experiences of disruption. These cultural echoes provide a vital human dimension to the archaeological data of ash layers and abandoned citadels. They show us how societies, in the long twilight after collapse, tried to make sense of the unimaginable. They processed the trauma not through academic analysis, but through poetry and sacred story, transforming the chaos of history into a meaningful saga of struggle, loss, and identity. The ruins were silent, but the bards were not. In their songs, the ghost of the Bronze Age world lived on, not as a historical record, but as a powerful, haunting memory of what was lost. The legends preserved a memory of the fall, but science offers us the fingerprints of the fall itself. To find the ultimate catalyst, we must look beyond the ruins of palaces and into the silent archives of the earth. Recent advances in paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climate, have uncovered a profound and unsettling truth. The world of the late Bronze Age did not merely face political turmoil, it was physically unraveling. By analyzing the chemical signatures locked within stalagmites from caves in the Near East and the sediment layers at the bottom of ancient lakes, researchers have reconstructed a picture of dramatic environmental change. The data reveals a sharp turn toward cooler and, most critically, much drier conditions beginning around the year 1200 before the Common Era. This was not a single harsh winter or a few bad harvests. It was a mega-drought, a relentless, multi-decadal shift that would have fundamentally altered the landscape of survival. Picture the Anatolian plateau, once capable of supporting the Hittite Empire's heartland. Under this new climatic regime, the winter rains grew sparse and unreliable. Springs that fed vital irrigation systems dwindled. The grain fields that filled the imperial storehouses yielded less and less with each passing season. This scenario repeated itself across the eastern Mediterranean, from the Levant to the Aegean. A study published in the journal Science examining fossilized pollen grains from lake sediments in Cyprus showed a dramatic decline in trees and a rise in drought-resistant plants right at this pivotal time, a clear botanical signal of intense aridification. The very foundation of these complex societies, a predictable agricultural surplus, was being swept away by a change in the wind and the rain. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Famine would have followed drought as night follows day. Populations weakened by hunger are far more susceptible to illness, and social order becomes fragile. People begin to move, abandoning parched inland farms for the hope of sustenance along the coasts or in river valleys still holding water. This created waves of internal refugees, placing immense new pressures on the very city-states and ports that were themselves struggling. This climatic shift was likely the engine that created the vast, desperate human pool from which the groups we call the Sea Peoples emerged. They were not a mysterious race appearing from nowhere. They were often the farmers, herders, and townsfolk of a failing interior, pushed to the edges of survival and then beyond. When the land can no longer support you, the sea becomes a highway of last resort. Some researchers have proposed triggers for this abrupt change, including the atmospheric aftereffects of major volcanic eruptions, which can spew sun-blocking particles into the stratosphere and disrupt global weather patterns for years. Others point to natural shifts in North Atlantic Ocean currents or atmospheric pressure systems. Whatever the precise mechanism, the outcome is clear in the geological record. Nature itself became a central, overwhelming character in this historical drama. It was the force that eroded the resilience of kingdoms from within, long before any foreign ship appeared on the horizon. The political squabbles, the trade disputes, the rivalries between great powers, all of these human conflicts were now playing out on a stage that was literally drying up and cracking beneath their feet. This scientific evidence reframes the entire collapse. It suggests that the invasions and the internal rebellions were not the cause of the crisis, but its most visible and violent symptoms. The true enemy was a changing sky, a silent, global force that no army could defeat and no diplomacy could appease. In the face of such a fundamental challenge, the intricate, brittle system of the Bronze Age world had no answer. The most dangerous enemy a king can face is not a foreign army, but his own starving people. What if the final blow to the Bronze Age world was not delivered by mysterious seafarers, but by the very hands that built its palaces? A compelling theory suggests that beneath the drama of invasions, a quieter, more insidious force was at work, a profound social revolt. For generations, the entire economic and spiritual life of these kingdoms had orbited the palace. It was the sole bank, the sole warehouse, the sole employer of scribes and artisans. The king, through his priests and officials, claimed a divine mandate to collect the harvest and redistribute it, a system that worked splendidly in times of plenty. But this created a breathtaking concentration of wealth and power at the very top, while the vast majority toiled in the fields. When the climate shifted and the rains failed, that sacred contract shattered. The storehouses, symbols of royal promise, began to empty. The palace could no longer provide, yet its demands for tribute and labor likely did not cease. The result was a powder keg of resentment. Imagine a farmer who has watched his children grow thin, who has buried neighbors lost to hardship, looking up at the limestone walls of the citadel where the elite still dine from fine painted cups. The idea of a foreign invader might have been a distant terror, but the injustice of a failing system was a daily, intimate agony. Archaeology offers subtle but telling clues that support this idea of internal collapse. At several destruction sites, researchers have noted a curious pattern. While the fires burned hot, evidence of precious metals, the gold and silver that would be the first target of any foreign plunderer, is often missing. In some cases, it appears these valuables were systematically removed before the final conflagration. This hints at a different scenario, not a swift sack by outsiders, but a period of internal chaos where the local population, aware of the impending doom, looted the palace treasuries themselves. They were taking back, or simply taking, what they felt was owed after years of service and suffering. Furthermore, the destruction layers sometimes show a pattern that feels more like a systemic dismantling than a battle. It is the difference between a bank robbery and the closing of a bank. In a revolt, the goal is not just to steal wealth, but to destroy the institution itself, to tear down the physical manifestation of a hated authority. The burning of the archive rooms, the places where the clay tablets recorded every jar of oil owed by every farmer, would have been a powerfully symbolic act. It was an attack on memory, on the very system of accounting that enforced the old order. This perspective forces us to re-examine the label of invader with new eyes. When a desperate mob storms the palace gates to the fleeing elites inside, they are indeed a terrifying, destructive horde. Their faces might be familiar, but in that moment they are the enemy. It is not difficult to see how such events, recounted by survivors or remembered in song, could over generations blur into tales of foreign attackers. The sea peoples described in Egyptian texts were a convenient external villain, a force of chaos from beyond the civilized world. It was far more palatable for a pharaoh to claim he defeated a mysterious coalition of sea raiders than to admit that the social fabric of neighboring kingdoms had torn itself apart from within. This internal rot theory does not dismiss the very real movement of peoples or the violence at the borders. Instead, it suggests these external pressures were the spark that ignited an already combustible situation. A kingdom hollowed out by famine, its legitimacy crumbling, its people alienated, would have had little strength to resist any shock, whether from outside or from within its own city walls. The true collapse, then, was a failure of resilience. The palace system, for all its artistic and administrative brilliance, had grown too rigid, too extractive, and too distant from the realities of the people it was meant to govern. When the climate crisis struck, it had no flexible response, no deep well of popular loyalty to draw upon. The elites were left isolated in their fortified citadels, not by invading armies, but by a tide of silent abandonment and finally, open rage. The great unraveling may have begun with a change in the weather, but it was completed by a loss of faith. So the question is not who destroyed the Bronze Age world, but how it could shatter so completely. Modern scholarship has largely moved away from the search for a single, simple villain. Instead, the prevailing explanation is a concept known as the system's collapse. It is a model that sees the end not as a murder, but as the catastrophic failure of an intricate and overloaded machine. Think of the late Bronze Age world as a vast, interconnected network, a kind of ancient internet of trade, diplomacy, and shared technology. For this system to function, dozens of critical components had to work in harmony: reliable harvests, secure shipping lanes, stable royal lineages, and cooperative relations between major powers. Historians like Cline describe what happened next not as an invasion, but as a perfect storm, a convergence of disasters where each one amplified the effects of the others. First, the climate engine began to falter, with prolonged drought straining agriculture from Anatolia to Greece. This environmental stress was the foundational shock, weakening societies from the inside out. Then, the ground itself trembled. Evidence of significant seismic activity in the region during this period suggests earthquakes damaged key cities and infrastructure, further eroding a sense of security and divine favor. These natural crises pushed populations into motion, creating refugees and straining resources at the coasts. This movement, in turn, disrupted the delicate balance of trade. As piracy rose and kingdoms turned inward, the vital flow of tin and copper for bronze weapons and tools began to sputter and halt. Internally, the social contract was breaking. A palace system that could no longer feed its people lost its legitimacy. Resentment festered, and in some places, this likely boiled over into localized revolts, the looting of royal storehouses and the burning of administrative records. Into this landscape of multiplying crises came the migratory groups we call the Sea Peoples. In the system's collapse model, they are not the primary cause, but the final, overwhelming stressor. They were both a product of the wider disintegration and an accelerant of it. A kingdom hollowed out by famine, its professional army unpaid and its trade partners silent, could not withstand a new wave of determined, mobile fighters. The arrival of these groups was the straw that broke the camel's back, but the back was already fractured by a dozen other burdens. This multifaceted model, supported by the work of scholars like Robert Drews who emphasized changes in warfare, helps us understand the sheer scale of the disaster. No single one of these factors, not the drought alone, nor the earthquakes, nor even the migrations, would likely have toppled every major kingdom across such a vast region. But together, they created a cascade of failure. The fall of the Hittite capital disrupted grain supplies to the Levant. The sacking of the port of Ugarit severed maritime trade to the Aegean. Each collapse removed a node from the network, increasing the strain on the next until the entire web unraveled. This shifts the mystery profoundly. We stop looking for a shadowy destroyer and start examining the inherent vulnerabilities of a complex, globalized society. It forces us to ask, what are the weak points in any interconnected system? How much strain can the links between nations withstand before they snap? The story of the Bronze Age collapse is no longer just an ancient whodunit. It is a sobering case study in systemic risk. A reminder that civilizations are not felled by a single sword, but by 1,000 cuts delivered by a changing world. Amid the vast silence, pockets of life and light stubbornly persisted. The collapse was not total, and tracing the paths of those who endured reveals the very anatomy of resilience. Along the rugged coastline of the Levant, the ancient cities of the Phoenicians, places like Byblos and Sidon, managed to hold on. Their survival was not a matter of escaping the turmoil, but of adapting to it with breathtaking pragmatism. These were port cities with a deep maritime tradition, and when the great palace-driven trade networks dissolved, they did not simply stop sailing. Instead, they pivoted. They shifted from long-distance haulage of bulk goods like copper and tin to smaller-scale, more agile commerce, focusing on high-value items like the prized purple dye extracted from sea snails and fine cedar wood from their hinterlands. Their social structure, less centralized than the great empires, may have allowed for quicker, more localized decision-making. They learned to navigate a more dangerous sea, not by conquering it, but by slipping through its cracks, setting the stage for their later explosion as master colonizers and explorers of the Mediterranean. To the south, the Kingdom of Egypt itself stands as the most prominent survivor. Pharaoh Ramesses III did indeed repel the major assault recorded at Medinet Habu, but the victory came at a tremendous cost. The once immense influence of Egypt in the Levant was gone, its access to foreign tribute and trade severely curtailed. The pharaonic state survived, but it entered a long period of contraction, economic difficulty, and diminished grandeur. Its resilience likely stemmed from its unique geographic fortress, protected by deserts and the Nile, and its incredibly deep cultural and bureaucratic continuity. Even in a weakened state, the idea of Egypt, the institution of the pharaoh, proved durable enough to maintain a core identity, though the golden age of empire was over. Even in the heart of the disaster zone in mainland Greece, life did not vanish. While the great palaces were never rebuilt, many communities carried on in a simpler form. Some settlements moved to more easily defensible locations like hilltops, suggesting a primary concern for security. The intricate linear bureaucracy was gone, but the people retained the fundamental skills of farming, herding, and crafting basic pottery. Their social organization appears to have simplified dramatically, shifting from a hierarchical, palace-centric model to smaller, likely kinship-based tribal groups. This was civilization in a compacted form, focusing on the essentials of subsistence and local community. The stories and cultural memory of the past, once managed by palace scribes, now lived in the oral traditions of bards, keeping alive the names of heroes and the echoes of lost cities. So what separated these survivors from the fallen? Several fragile advantages emerge. Geographic defensibility played a role, whether it was Egypt's natural barriers or a coastal city's walls. Perhaps more crucially, some communities were less utterly dependent on the very system that collapsed. A city already skilled in flexible, independent trade had an alternative to the palace economy. A society with a more decentralized power structure could adapt without a single point of catastrophic failure. Ultimately, resilience in this dark age meant the ability to simplify, to let go of the grand complexities of the Bronze Age and focus on a smaller, more sustainable way of life. It meant prioritizing local security and local sustenance over international prestige. These surviving pockets were not untouched by the disaster, they were forever changed by it. They were the green shoots pushing through the ash, demonstrating that civilization is not an all-or-nothing state, but a continuum. It can contract, shed its most elaborate layers, and still preserve a core from which something new and entirely different can slowly grow. The silence that settled over Greece was deep and enduring. In the place of the great citadels like Mycenae and Pylos, with their frescoed walls and bustling workshops, life contracted into a much smaller, quieter existence. The archaeological record from the centuries following the collapse tells a story of profound simplification. The population fell dramatically, with estimates suggesting a drop of perhaps 75% or more. The grand, interconnected world of the Mycenaean palaces was gone, replaced by small, scattered villages, often tucked away on remote hillsides for security. These communities were largely self-sufficient, focused on subsistence farming and herding. The material culture became strikingly modest. The fine, wheel-made pottery with intricate designs gave way to simpler, handmade wares. The vibrant artistic expression, the seal stones, the gold jewelry, the skills of fresco painting and monumental stonework all but vanished from daily life. Most tellingly, the written word disappeared entirely. The linear B script, used for centuries to manage the complex palace economies, was forgotten. For nearly 400 years, Greece entered a period with no written records at all, a true historical silence we now call the Greek Dark Ages. This was not merely a political collapse, it was a cultural amnesia on a staggering scale. An entire society seemed to forget how to be what it once was. This long twilight forces us to confront a difficult question. How does a civilization begin again after losing so much of its own knowledge? The Greek experience shows that recovery is not a return but a reinvention. The old, centralized palace system was gone for good. In its place, a new social order slowly coalesced, based on smaller kinship groups and local chieftains. Power became more personal and less bureaucratic. Without writing, memory and identity were preserved orally. It was in these centuries that the epic stories of a heroic past, tales of the Trojan War and the great kings of Mycenae, were shaped and passed down by bards. These poems, like those of Homer later written down, became the living library of a people, preserving a ghostly echo of the lost Bronze Age world while helping to forge a new Pan-Hellenic identity. The isolation also bred a fierce localism. The city-state, or polis, began to take root as the fundamental political unit. Cut off from the old international networks, each community had to rely on its own resources and forge its own laws. The end of the Dark Ages, around the 8th century before the Common Era, was marked not by a sudden revolution, but by a gradual reawakening. Contact with the wider Mediterranean, particularly through Phoenician traders, slowly resumed. From these exchanges, the Greeks adopted a revolutionary new technology, an alphabet. But they did not simply copy it, they adapted it brilliantly, creating the first writing system designed to record a spoken language with clarity and efficiency. This was not a rediscovery of Linear B, it was the invention of something entirely new and more powerful. With the alphabet, the oral tales could be fixed, laws could be codified, and new forms of poetry and philosophy could emerge. The world that grew from this stripped-down foundation was not a replica of the Mycenaean past. It was something radically different, the decentralized, competitive, and intellectually explosive world of archaic and classical Greece. The collapse had cleared the ground, wiping away the old hierarchical structures. The slow, painful centuries of the Dark Ages were a necessary crucible, a time when simpler, more resilient forms of community were forged from the ashes. This case study reveals a profound truth about civilizational resilience. Sometimes, to move forward, a society must first contract to its core, preserving only the most essential threads of memory and skill before it can weave an entirely new and unexpected tapestry. The transition from bronze to iron was not a sudden conquest, but a slow, practical surrender to a broken world. For centuries, bronze had been the supreme material of civilization, an alloy of copper and tin that could be cast into sharp weapons, fine tools, and beautiful art. But its recipe relied on a fragile, far-flung supply chain. Copper came from places like Cyprus, while tin traveled thousands of miles from distant sources in Afghanistan or beyond. When the great trade networks of the Bronze Age shattered, that supply chain snapped. Suddenly, the essential ingredient for maintaining an army or equipping farmers became scarce, expensive, or simply impossible to find. Societies were faced with a stark choice: adapt or perish. In this climate of scarcity, a once difficult alternative began to look increasingly attractive: iron. The key advantage of iron was not initially its superior strength, but its profound availability. Iron ore is one of the most common elements on Earth, found in rocky hillsides and bogs across the Mediterranean. A community no longer needed to rely on a king's diplomacy or a merchant's dangerous voyage. They could often find the raw material they needed within a day's walk. This shift from a globalized material to a local one perfectly mirrored the broader collapse of the era. The world was turning inward, relying on what it could find close to home. The process of unlocking iron from its ore, however, was a formidable technical challenge. Bronze smelting required temperatures around 1,000 degrees Celsius. Iron demands several hundred degrees more, a significant leap for ancient furnace technology. The early process, known as bloomery smelting, did not produce molten metal. Instead, it created a spongy mass of iron mixed with slag, called a bloom. This bloom then had to be repeatedly heated and hammered, a labor-intensive process, to force out the impurities and consolidate the metal into a usable bar. The resulting wrought iron was not inherently harder than good bronze, it was often softer. The revolutionary breakthrough came with the discovery of carburization. Repeatedly heating the iron in a charcoal fire allowed carbon atoms from the fuel to seep into the metal surface. When this steel-like material was then rapidly cooled or quenched, it became vastly harder and could hold a sharper edge. This knowledge did not arrive overnight with invaders. It was a slow accumulation of skill, likely developed in places like Anatolia and gradually disseminated through the fractured post-collapse world. The narrative that the Sea Peoples introduced iron weaponry as a secret weapon is a compelling myth, but the archaeological timeline does not support it. Iron objects, often small and ceremonial, appear in royal context centuries before the collapse. A dagger with an iron blade found in the tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, dating to the 14th century before the Common Era, is a famous example. What changed after the collapse was not the invention of iron, but its democratization. As the palace workshops that monopolized bronze production vanished, local smiths began experimenting more widely with the tricky but accessible iron ores. The superior potential of well-worked iron, once fully realized, was transformative. An iron plowshare could till tougher soil, opening new land for farming. An iron axe could clear forests more efficiently, and on the battlefield, while a bronze sword could bend in the heat of combat, a properly forged iron blade was more resilient. This technological transition, therefore, was not the spark of the collapse, but one of its most enduring consequences. It was a story of resilience and adaptation, of communities solving a critical problem of scarcity with patience, fire, and hammer blows. The Iron Age did not dawn because of a mysterious invasion. It slowly emerged from the ashes because the old way of making the world work had gone up in smoke. But how can we possibly know the details of a collapse that happened over 3,000 years ago? The answer lies not in grand narratives, but in the patient, meticulous work of modern detectives. These are the archaeologists, epigraphers, and scientists who sift through the silent aftermath, reading stories in things most of us would overlook. Their investigation begins with the ground itself, with the distinct layers of earth that accumulate over centuries like pages in a book. At a site like ancient Ugarit or Pylos, they look for a specific telling sequence. First, they find a layer of daily life, pottery shards, animal bones, and the foundations of homes. Then, abruptly, they hit a thick, dark band of ash and charcoal, often mixed with collapsed mudbrick and shattered stones. This is the destruction layer, the physical fingerprint of the final catastrophe. Within that chaotic stratum, the smallest objects become crucial evidence. A bronze arrowhead lodged in a wall might indicate conflict. The absence of precious metals could suggest looting before the fire. The way a massive stone block has fallen outward rather than inward can point to an earthquake's force rather than a battering ram. Each fragment is catalogued, its position mapped with precision because context is everything. A single potsherd means little, but a cluster of fine drinking cups crushed beneath a collapsed ceiling in a palace storeroom paints a vivid picture of sudden, violent ruin. Alongside the field archaeologists work the epigraphers, the specialists in ancient writing. In the ashes of administrative buildings, they sometimes find the most poignant clues of all, the unbaked clay tablets that were caught in the fire. The intense heat that destroyed the palace ironically preserved these records for millennia, baking them hard. At Pylos, tablets written in the Linear B script were found literally on the floors of offices, as if the scribes had fled in the middle of their work. These are not epic poems or royal decrees. They are mundane inventories, lists of chariot wheels, counts of sheep, and records of linen deliveries. Yet in their very ordinariness, they are priceless. They offer a snapshot of the palace economy in its final days, revealing what was considered important enough to track right up to the end. They tell us the names of officials and farmers, the geographic reach of the kingdom's authority, and the specialized crafts it supported. When these records stop, we are not just witnessing a political change, we are witnessing the end of a whole system of thought and organization. The silence of the Linear B tablets marks the exact moment when a way of managing the world was forgotten. The detective work extends far beyond the dig site, into laboratories where natural scientists reconstruct the ancient environment. Here, the evidence comes from sources no human ever intended to leave behind. Paleobotanists study cores of sediment extracted from the bottoms of ancient lakes or marshes. Within these muddy timelines, they find fossilized pollen grains, tiny and incredibly durable. By identifying the types of plants these pollen grains came from, scientists can chart dramatic shifts in the landscape. A core showing a sudden decline in tree pollen from oaks and pines, coupled with a spike in pollen from drought-resistant weeds and grasses, provides direct physical proof of the mega-drought that gripped the region. Meanwhile, dendrochronologists examine the growth rings of ancient timber, sometimes recovered from archaeological sites or preserved in bogs. Narrow, tightly spaced rings tell a story of years with poor growing conditions, of stunted growth due to lack of rain. When these climate proxies from different locations all tell the same story of aridification around 1200 before the Common Era, the environmental backdrop of the collapse comes into sharp, undeniable focus. This is how a modern case is built, by weaving together these disparate threads: the ash layer in Turkey, the inventory tablet in Greece, and the pollen core from Cyprus. Each discipline provides a piece of the puzzle. The archaeologist's trowel, the epigrapher's dictionary, and the scientist's microscope are all tools in the same investigation, working to listen to the whispers of a world that has been silent for centuries. Our understanding is never static. It evolves with each new excavation, each re-examined artifact, and each technological breakthrough, reminding us that history is not just a story we tell, but a mystery we are forever solving. The shadowy nature of the Sea Peoples has made them a magnet for modern myth. It is tempting to fill the historical silence with grand, sweeping narratives, but the evidence we have gathered acts as a powerful corrective. One of the most persistent fantasies links these invaders to the lost continent of Atlantis. This connection is a modern invention, a compelling but false fusion of two separate mysteries. The story of Atlantis comes from the Greek philosopher Plato, writing around 400 before the Common Era. He presented it not as history, but as a political allegory, a cautionary tale about a powerful society that succumbs to pride and is punished by the gods. There is no mention of the Sea Peoples in his dialogues, and no archaeological evidence has ever been found to suggest a sunken civilization was involved in the Bronze Age collapse. The two stories became entangled centuries later, a classic case of two enigmatic puzzles being forced into the same box because they both involve a great disaster and the sea. Another common simplification is the idea of the Sea Peoples as a single, unified nation of pirates, a coordinated naval empire sweeping across the Mediterranean with a common flag and purpose. The records simply do not support this. As we have seen, the Egyptian lists at Medinet Habu name multiple distinct groups: the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and others. These were different peoples, likely with different origins, languages, and immediate goals. The term Sea Peoples is a modern label of convenience, not an ancient self-identification. They were a coalition of circumstance, not a standing army. Think of them less as a unified invasion force and more as a chaotic convergence of refugees, displaced warriors, and opportunistic raiders, all pushed into motion by the same systemic crises. Their power came from their collective desperation and mobility, not from a shared national identity. A third myth suggests these groups brought entirely new cultures that completely replaced what was there before. Archaeology tells a more nuanced story of blending and adaptation. Take the Philistines linked to the Peliset. Excavations at sites like Ashkelon reveal a fascinating cultural mosaic. In their earliest levels, we find pottery that is distinctly Aegean in style alongside local Canaanite pottery. Over the next few generations, these styles begin to merge, creating a unique Philistine material culture. They adopted local gods like Dagon while also maintaining traditions that connected them to the wider Mediterranean world. This is not a story of erasure, but of synthesis. Newcomers settled, interacted with the surviving local populations, and together forged a new hybrid society. The old order was not replaced by a foreign blueprint. It was reshaped by a complex process of contact, conflict, and eventual coexistence. Debunking these myths is not about dismissing the mystery. It is about honoring the real human complexity of the past. The true history of the collapse, with its web of climate change, social unrest, and desperate migration, is far more compelling than any simple tale of a lost civilization or a barbarian horde. It is a story about the fragility of interconnected systems and the resilience of people in the face of unimaginable change. By clearing away the fantasy, we make space to appreciate the profound and often sobering reality of how civilizations truly rise, fall, and transform. This grounded understanding invites a final, broader reflection. If the Sea Peoples were not a supernatural force or a singular evil, but a symptom of a world in crisis, what does their story and the monumental collapse they were part of ultimately tell us about our own globalized age? 3,000 years later, the echoes of that collapse feel unsettlingly familiar. Our world is built on a network of connections far more vast and instantaneous than anything the Bronze Age could have conceived. Yet the underlying principle remains hauntingly similar. We are all bound together by invisible threads of trade, information, and mutual dependence. Just as the Hittite king relied on grain from Egypt and tin from Afghanistan, we rely on semiconductors from Taiwan, medical supplies from Asia, and energy flows that cross continents. This intricate web delivers incredible prosperity and innovation, but it also creates shared points of failure. The lesson from the rubble is not that globalization is fragile, but that all highly interconnected systems carry within them a latent vulnerability. When one critical node fails, the shock can ripple outward with astonishing speed, amplifying as it travels through the network. A drought in one breadbasket region can spike global food prices. A blockage in a single maritime choke point can paralyze supply chains for months. A financial crisis originating in one nation's housing market can trigger a worldwide recession. Our vulnerabilities are not identical to those of the late Bronze Age, but they are structural cousins born from the same reality of deep interdependence. So we must ask ourselves, in our own complex system, what are the modern equivalents of that ancient mega-drought? Climate change stands as the most profound parallel. A slow-moving, global environmental stressor that threatens agricultural patterns, displaces populations, and intensifies competition for resources. A pandemic reveals how quickly a health crisis can become an economic and social one, shutting down mobility and straining the very institutions meant to ensure stability. Even our greatest strength, our digital nervous system, presents a new frontier of risk. A coordinated cyber attack on financial networks or power grids could create a sudden, silent rupture in the flow of critical information, a digital dark age that would make the loss of linear B seem swift by comparison. These are not predictions of doom, but acknowledgments of systemic stress points. The collapse teaches us that civilizations are not permanent edifices. They are dynamic processes that require active maintenance, adaptation, and, above all, resilience. Resilience is the antidote to fragility. For the Bronze Age world, resilience might have meant more decentralized food storage, more diverse trade partners, or more flexible social structures. For us, it means building redundancies into supply chains, investing in sustainable and local energy sources, hardening critical infrastructure, and fostering social cohesion that can withstand shocks. It means recognizing that our security is increasingly tied not just to our military might, but to the stability of our partners and the health of our planet. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is ultimately a case study in transformation. The old order fell because it could not adapt to a convergence of crises. The world that emerged from the ashes was different, poorer in many ways for centuries, but also cleared of certain rigidities, eventually giving rise to new political ideas, new technologies, and new forms of cultural expression. Understanding this ancient disaster, then, is not an exercise in morbid fascination. It is a tool for analysis, a distant mirror held up to our own era. It asks us to look at our glittering, interconnected world and see not just its triumphs, but its architecture, to identify the load-bearing walls and the potential fault lines. By studying how one globalized world came apart, we gain a deeper appreciation for the careful, conscious work required to hold our own together, not through isolation, but through wiser, more resilient connection. Even with all we have uncovered, the story remains punctuated by profound silences. Decades of meticulous research have illuminated the Bronze Age collapse, yet stubborn gaps in our knowledge persist, reminding us that some whispers from the past may never be fully heard. One of the most tantalizing mysteries centers on the precise origins of the groups labeled Sea Peoples. While connections like the Peliset to the Philistines are compelling, the homelands of others, like the Shekelesh or the Denyen, are still debated. Were they from Sicily, Sardinia, or the coast of Anatolia? The evidence offers clues but not definitive addresses. This ambiguity forces us to confront the reality of a fragmented, mobile world where identities were fluid and the records of the displaced themselves did not survive. Similarly, the exact sequence of events at doomed capitals like Hattusa remains a subject of intense scrutiny. Was the great Hittite city abandoned after a siege, or did a final, catastrophic fire consume an already evacuated shell? The ash layers tell of an ending, but the precise choreography of that ending, the order in which diplomacy failed, gates were breached, and flames took hold, is still being pieced together from the stratigraphy. Each season of excavation offers a chance to refine the timeline, to understand whether the end came in a season or over years of dwindling hope. Perhaps the most haunting question of all concerns cultural memory. How much of the grandeur and trauma of the Bronze Age world was preserved in the oral traditions of the survivors, and how much vanished forever when the last scribe laid down his stylus? The epic poems that later emerged are powerful, but they are also transformations where historical events are reshaped into mythic archetypes. We will never know exactly how the fall of Ugarit was recounted by a grieving parent to their child, or what songs the displaced sang around campfires as they traveled. That intimate human dimension of the disaster is largely lost to time. These open questions, however, are not failures of history. They are its exciting frontiers. They represent the blank spaces on the map that invite new generations of scholars, archaeologists, and curious minds to contribute. A newly translated fragment of a clay tablet, a deep-sea sonar scan revealing a shipwreck from that pivotal era, or a novel method for analyzing ancient climate data could reshape the narrative overnight. Acknowledging these enduring mysteries is what keeps the story alive and dynamic. It emphasizes that history is not a closed book of settled facts, but an ongoing conversation with the past, a dialogue between the questions we ask and the evidence we patiently uncover. The search continues, driven equally by scientific rigor and by a fundamental human curiosity to understand our own resilience, our vulnerabilities, and the long echoes of a world that once was. Out of the long silence, a new world was being born. The collapse did not just end an age, it acted as a great historical reset, clearing away old structures and making space for entirely new ways of organizing human life. This profound rupture, while devastating, became the unlikely cradle for the classical civilizations we recognize today. In Greece, the most dramatic transformation took place. The powerful, centralized monarchies of the Mycenaean era, with their godlike kings and sprawling bureaucracies, were gone forever. In their absence, power fragmented and localized. People gathered in smaller, more defensible communities, often centered around a fortified hill or acropolis. From this practical need for security and cooperation, a revolutionary political unit slowly crystallized: the polis or city-state. Without a distant palace dictating terms, these communities had to govern themselves. They began to experiment with shared citizenship, collective defense, and local lawmaking. The collapse of the old hierarchical order was, paradoxically, the necessary precondition for the rise of Athenian democracy centuries later. It forced communities to rely on debate, compromise, and the participation of their own members, planting the seeds for a political culture that would eventually produce philosophy, drama, and a new idea of civic freedom. Across the sea in the Levant, a similar power vacuum allowed for the emergence of new identities. With the great empires of Egypt and the Hittites in retreat or ruin, smaller groups could consolidate power without facing an overwhelming imperial force. In the hill country of Canaan, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah began to coalesce. Their foundational stories, later compiled in the Hebrew Bible, are steeped in the imagery of this turbulent period. Narratives of exodus, conquest, and the struggle to establish a society under a single god. The cultural memory of displacement and the fight for a homeland may well echo the real experiences of smaller peoples navigating the chaotic aftermath of the Great Collapse. The trauma of that era seems to have left a deep imprint on the region's cultural psyche, fostering themes of catastrophe, divine judgment, and the hope for renewal that would become central to Western religious thought. This legacy extends into the very stories we tell. The mythological cycles of the ancient Greeks can be read as a profound processing of this historical trauma. The epics of Homer are not set in his own time, but in a lost, heroic age of greater grandeur and tragic fall. The Trojan War, with its tale of a glorious coalition sailing to its doom and heroes returning to shattered kingdoms, feels like a poetic memory of the interconnected world that came apart. These myths provided a bridge across the Dark Ages, allowing the Greeks to maintain a connection to their past while defining their own values against the backdrop of a fallen golden age. The collapse, therefore, was not a sterile ending. It was a violent and painful act of pruning that allowed for new growth. By dismantling the rigid, top-heavy systems of the Bronze Age, it created the conditions for political experimentation, from the republics of Phoenician city-states to the tribal confederacies of early Israel. It cleared the intellectual ground too. Without the orthodoxy of a single palace-supported priesthood or a rigid scribal tradition, new questions could be asked about the nature of the gods, justice, and human society. The first millennium before the Common Era, with its burst of philosophical inquiry, alphabetic literacy, and novel political forms, was directly fertilized by the ashes of the 12th century. The legacy of the collapse reminds us that history's most devastating fractures are often also its most generative breaks, setting the stage for worlds the fallen could never have imagined. The past is not a closed book, but a manuscript we are still learning to read. Every year, new discoveries refine our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse, not by rewriting the story, but by adding depth and color to its most shadowy chapters. One of the most powerful new tools comes from a source we carry within ourselves, ancient DNA. By extracting and analyzing genetic material from human remains at sites across the Mediterranean, scientists are now tracing population movements with unprecedented precision. These studies are moving us beyond the broad labels of invaders and locals. For instance, genetic evidence from the Levant suggests that new groups did arrive on the coast around the time of the collapse, their genetic signatures distinct from the local populations, supporting the idea of a significant migration event. Yet the data also reveals a story of integration, not replacement. Over the following generations, these genetic lines blended, painting a picture of communities that were forged through contact and coexistence, not simple conquest. This biological evidence adds a profound human layer to the pottery shards and burned walls, confirming movements while complicating the narrative of a clean ethnic sweep. On the ground, archaeologists continue to uncover cities that defy the simple label of total destruction. At Tel Teynat in southeastern Turkey, excavations have revealed the remains of a powerful kingdom known as Patina, or later, Unkai. This was not a Hittite capital, but a vibrant Neo-Hittite state that emerged in the centuries immediately after the great empire's fall. Its rulers used Hittite hieroglyphic script and claimed titles that echoed the imperial past, yet they built their palaces and carved their monuments in a new era. Tel Teynat stands as a powerful testament to resilience, showing that Hittite culture and political organization did not vanish, but adapted and persisted in regional centers long after Hattusa was abandoned. It forces us to reconsider the collapse not as a uniform event of universal darkness, but as a patchwork of endings and new beginnings, where some threads of the old world were carefully rewoven into the fabric of the new. The most compelling modern research does not belong to any single discipline. Today, historians, archaeologists, and climate scientists are collaborating in ways that would have been impossible a generation ago. Interdisciplinary projects are creating sophisticated models that simulate how the various stressors, drought, earthquake, trade disruption, and migration could have interacted to overwhelm the Bronze Age system. By inputting archaeological data on settlement patterns, paleoclimate records of rainfall, and estimates of agricultural yields, these models test different scenarios, helping scholars understand which combinations of events could have led to such a widespread and rapid failure. This work moves the discussion from a list of possible causes to a dynamic understanding of their synergistic effects. It underscores a crucial point: the collapse was not the sum of its parts, but the product of their dangerous multiplication. Each excavation season holds the potential for a revelation. A shipwreck discovered on the seabed, its cargo intact, could tell us exactly what was being traded in the final, tense years. A previously unknown archive of clay tablets, perhaps from a minor kingdom, might offer a ground-level view of the crisis as it unfolded. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is therefore alive. It is a conversation between the questions we ask today and the answers the Earth reluctantly yields. This forward-looking perspective is perhaps the most important lesson of all. It reminds us that history is not just about what happened, but about our endless, fascinated pursuit of understanding it. The silent cities of the past still have much to say, and we are only now learning how to listen. The silent ruins left by the collapse are slowly regaining their voices, not through words but through breathtaking digital light. Archaeologists and artists now collaborate to rebuild these lost cities on our screens, using the precise measurements of every excavated stone and the chemical analysis of ancient plaster to resurrect entire worlds. You can now stand in a virtual Ugarit, watching its busy harbor come to life. Ships with high prows are tied to the quay, unloading copper ingots as merchants barter in the shadow of the city's towering temples. The air is thick with the scent of spices and the sound of a dozen languages. This digital recreation, built from decades of site plans and artifact studies, allows us to walk the streets of a cosmopolitan hub at the very peak of its prosperity. Then, with a sobering click, the simulation can shift. The same view is swallowed by an orange glow, the meticulous architecture crumbling into the distinctive layer of ash and rubble that archaeologists actually found. This visual journey from vibrant life to silent destruction makes an abstract historical process devastatingly concrete. It transforms statistical terms like systems collapse into a visceral human experience, letting us witness the scale of what was lost in a single, catastrophic generation. These reconstructions are grounded in the physical objects that survived the flames. In museums around the world, glass cases hold the poignant artifacts pulled from the destruction layers themselves. A storage jar from Pylos, its clay permanently blackened by the palace fire, sits next to a similar jar found intact, reminding us of the ordinary commerce that was suddenly frozen in time. A bronze sword, bent and nicked from its final use, tells a silent story of conflict without naming the combatants. Perhaps most moving are the small, personal treasures, a gold signet ring hastily hidden beneath a floor, or a delicate ivory cosmetic spoon found amidst the debris of a wealthy home. These were not the grandiose monuments of pharaohs, but the belongings of everyday people caught in an unimaginable crisis. Seeing them up close, noting the craftsmanship and the wear from human hands, bridges a gap of 3,000 years. We are no longer studying a distant catastrophe. We are witnessing the interrupted lives of individuals who loved, traded, and sought beauty, just as we do. This tangible evidence, from the grand digital simulation to the smallest charred seed, serves a profound purpose. It rescues the story from the realm of dry academic theory and plants it firmly in the realm of human experience. We can begin to fathom the terror of the scribe who fled his desk at Pylos, leaving his damp clay tablet to be baked by the encroaching fire. We can sense the desperation of the family that buried their few valuables, hoping to return to a home that would never again be safe. These visual and physical connections do more than illustrate history. They generate empathy. They force us to ask not just what happened, but what it felt like. By making the past immediate, they transform our understanding of the collapse from a historical puzzle into a shared human story of resilience facing unimaginable pressure. This visceral connection raises the final, inevitable question: with all we now see and understand, what ultimate meaning can we draw from such a monumental fall? That final, painful transformation from bronze to iron carries the ultimate lesson of this ancient disaster. Civilizations are not mountains carved in stone and meant to stand forever. They are more like complex, living ecosystems, vibrant networks of trade, trust, and tradition that can flourish under the right conditions, but are vulnerable to a perfect storm of stress. The story we have pieced together reveals a world undone not by a single villain, but by a cascade of interconnected failures. A changing climate parched the fields, earthquakes shook the foundations of power, and internal revolts fractured the social contract. Into this fray came the displaced and the desperate, the group's history remembers as the Sea Peoples, who were as much a product of the collapse as its final, violent instrument. Their mystery endures not because they were supernatural destroyers, but because they represent the human face of a systemic unraveling, the moment when a network of kingdoms became a flood of refugees. This deep dive through ash and inscription shows us that the greatest threats are often slow and silent, like a drought, or deeply embedded, like a rigid social order that cannot adapt. The collapse was a catastrophic event, a historical quake that leveled a glittering age. Yet, as the historian Fern and Braudel reminds us, history is also about duration, the long, slow currents that flow beneath the surface of events. The duration, the human story, did not end. people survived, they remembered, they adapted, and from the stripped-down foundations of a simpler life, they slowly built something new. The Phoenicians took to the sea with renewed purpose. In Greece, the seeds of the city-state were planted in the quiet soil of a dark age. This is the dual legacy of the collapse, a stark warning about fragility paired with an enduring testament to resilience. We study this distant catastrophe not to assign ancient blame, but to see our own world more clearly. Our global civilization is a network of astonishing complexity and interdependence, a system with its own profound strengths and hidden vulnerabilities. The past asks us to consider with humility and foresight what threads we rely on today and how we might strengthen them against the convergent storms of tomorrow. The silent cities of the Bronze Age have finally given up their central truth. Civilizations fall, but humanity's story, in all its struggle and ingenuity, continues.